What a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you very much for the invitation. I have a very soft spot in my heart for Guelph University, and you'll learn a little bit about that as we progress this evening. But it is also always a pleasure to be part of a dynamic, engaged event such as this. And part of what I'm going to do tonight, which is really showing my bias, some of my favourite after-dinner speakers are not those that present details of their research and get down to the brass tacks of numbers and figures, but are the ones that try to capture the essence of what we have been amongst. And so that's really what I'm going to be focusing on tonight, is some of the messages that I feel that have risen to the surface out of this extraordinary event, and that capture this idea in particular of critical links. So as I begin, I'm just going to locate myself slightly. You'll learn a little bit about me as we go along, but I am from New Zealand, as you heard. I'm from a small town of 30,000 people on the east coast of the South Island of New Zealand. But currently I'm living in northern BC, and the photograph that you see here, and you are going to see it a lot, is taken from Ness Lake, a little lake by which I lived near to Prince George. And this was taken in a kayak last fall. And it was an extraordinary moment that I will never forget. And there's lots of reasons why it was extraordinary, and part of it is to do with the themes I'm going to touch on this evening. So it is quite intentful, and you will see it a lot. If you're getting bored with what I have to say, I encourage you to just look at the photograph. So yes, I am my research chair is in health, ecosystems and society, and those are some of the things you're going to hear about. So this is quite a treat in some ways. I was, when I was doing my PhD research, I was told that I used the word critical a little bit too often. And that's true, it is a word that can be overused, and it does need to be thoughtfully approached. And so I think there's many reasons in this event that have really highlighted that there are critical issues. And those are critical issues that are focused on links. Now, I'm obviously somebody interested in the links between health, ecosystems and society, but I have learned an enormous amount about those links through this particular lens of the connections between humans and animals. And so that theme will also come through as we go throughout my talk, reflecting on themes that we've heard. In many ways, I feel that this session is picking up. There's been wonderful sessions this afternoon, but James Orbinski's talk left us with a whole lot of ideas around important connections that I'm going to be expanding on. So here's this word, critical. And I imagine it was thoughtfully chosen by the committee, but it might not have been. Nonetheless, I think it's really relevant. And it's critical in the sense that we need to consider these points at which things could become disastrous or at a point of crisis. There's a scary element to critical. But there's also this other dimension in terms of momentum for the future, of decisive or crucial importance in the success, failure, existence of something. And so we're talking about critical links that there's an imperative about what we're talking about. And it's important, as we consider that imperative, to say what we mean and mean what we say. The words we use at this juncture, at these interfaces, are important. And so there's going to be quite a bit of emphasis on the words and their meanings that empower what we do, because words are one of our greatest tools, obviously, for leading our collective action. As I mentioned, I am particularly interested in the critical links between human and animal health. And this cartoon is probably by one of my favourite poets and cartoonists, Lernig. And I'm sure I hope you can see the sign saying, "Be the change you wish to see." And in fact, I could really leave my talk here, because at its core, this is my sense, this is why for me the connections between humans and animals are important, is the sense of interconnection, that we are deeply interconnected in ways that are both fathomable and unfathomable, and that our aspirations as we explore those connections can even take form in ways like this, directly or indirectly, in our sense of our future and our sense of our past and our sense of our connectedness with that which is around us. And I want to pick up on James Orbinski's words when he said today around this idea of needing to foster a new and genuine humility, of new ways of seeing ourselves in relation to each other and to other life forms, that recognizing each other and seeing the sameness, not just with other humans, but with other species, of defining ourself, that does not mean the subordination of ourself, but means that we can be ourselves in relation to others. As you recall, for those of you that were there, I asked Dr. Orbinski to elaborate on some of these dynamics, and he pointed out that this is tough. We kind of understand it intuitively. There's an intuitive recognition of these ideas, but to manifest those things in the nuts and bolts of how we conduct research and how we proceed as human beings in relation to our colleagues, they're challenges that are worth pondering. And so that's why I'm taking some of your time to ponder and explore some of those challenges. So there were some sub-themes to this event, which I find very compelling. Clearly, somebody that's interested in health ecosystems and society in the context of watersheds find this package of words quite interesting. And I've got a series of photographs up here that are also explanatory because I have chosen in this presentation to show mostly photographs of places where I have lived the most. And those places that I have lived the most are New Zealand and Canada. So I'd like to point out that for me, Canada is international. So I am speaking of my international development work in Canada. And that's an important idea that I'm wanting to play on throughout this conversation. Of course, I have become I am a Canadaphile, I'm not sure. But it is a choice that I made. I have been very fortunate to have lived in New Zealand and Europe and Belgium, you heard, where I got my Masters in Human Ecology, to have worked in Geneva, to have lived and worked in Hawaii, to have spent an intensive period of learning in Ecuador. But I have lived the most in Canada and New Zealand. So those are the images you're going to see. And as we do that, I want you to hold in your mind that idea that James Orbinski challenged us with, that all global is inherently local. And so we are actually doing global work when we are embedded in those local issues. So those are themes that will emerge. So too is the second framing cartoon, which is a favourite of mine, and I'm going to come back to it a couple of times. I've shown this part not so much to talk about myself, but to highlight what I think many people in this room have experienced. Most people that are sitting here tonight are in some ways boundary crossers. They have begun in one place, they have chosen out of curiosity or compulsion or imperative to cross a boundary. They have experienced whichever boundary they were crossing, some kind of whiplash injury as they flick their heads back and forth between those things that they have done and they are doing and where is the most important thing. There's a nestedness to this image that's really important. So the individual in some ways is shown as equivalent to the public health area, that collective dimension of public, and so there's a wee bit of a disconnect there, but the embeddedness that I'm interested in, that nestedness, is that both of those things are embedded within broader ecosystems. And in my case, my work has sort of gone from medicine and interest in public health and human ecology into watersheds, some of my colleagues say to me, Margot, you've gone so far upstream, we don't even know what you're doing anymore. This upstream word of these ideas of there are landscapes as well as social processes that determine what is upstream is captured by this idea. So certainly throughout as we go, I'm going to be touching on these ideas, but I want you to hear for yourself, to ponder yourself, what boundaries have you crossed and what challenges, existential or otherwise, has that created? And how does it manifest? How has it added value to your work and the work and your interactions with others to have had the courage to do that boundary crossing? What to be thinking about it? So here I've talked about my journey as a medical doctor into public health and training in human ecology. I came back to New Zealand, which is where I grounded myself in many of the understandings around watersheds that we call them catchments in the Antipodes, river catchments and their implications for health and well-being, how we manage land and water resources, having multiple pathways that impact on health. I moved to Hawaii to help launch the journal. I came to Vancouver. And when I first came to Canada, Guelph was one of the places, and I'm not just saying this to I had really quite an extraordinary set of experiences from Guelph, and you will see a couple of them here. And that's because I think the animal connection for me has shifted. A small anecdote is that, as some of you know, New Zealand has no endemic mammals. So we have no native furry creatures other than a bat. And so for me, the notion of connecting with animals in terms of their endemism, it's really not something that I grew up with. I grew up with fantastic birds, but not so many furry animals. So the animal connection, the sort of all our relations understanding of animals that I've learned about in Canada, has been certainly fueled by Canada and really brought to life, particularly with colleagues such as David Waltner-Taves and Bruce Hunter, who were extraordinary teachers to me in helping me to understand that. The other two images at the bottom of the slide, the top one I stole from the Guelph website, so I'll just fess that up. But the other two are from the EcoHealth Summer School that we held in Guelph as part of the Cope Canada annual summer schools that move around the country, and it was hosted in Guelph. So we see in the middle a stakeholder workshop in Hamilton, Ontario, and we see at the bottom our crazy group of people celebrating the end of the course. And if you're wondering what people's arms are doing, you can't really see it, but I'd like to mention it, is that they're all sort of doing this. And that was because one of the symbols of this was of the whole course was carps, and the notion of the way in which carps and their role in the lake were a way for us to understand all sorts of interesting issues. So there's a sort of an animal embedded in that cluster of people. I also couldn't resist this as I walked into the presentations at the beginning of the session. There are things about this work that are actually really very challenging, and I think we need to acknowledge it. That there is a way in which coming to these events that make our brains and hearts and things get stretched that can be deeply uncomfortable, and it's not, let's be honest, it's not always the best career move to do this integrative work. It can be, and I feel extremely fortunate that I've been able to navigate that, but there is a courage and tenacity that you need to have, and that's some of these critical links that I'm going to continue to elaborate as we go on. So there is an acknowledgement that there are dangers here, and that we need to figure out how we collectively will help each other navigate those. So you'll see this slide a few times, a time to ponder a moment around your sense of critical links between humans and animals. Where do you see those critical links? How have you learned more about them over the last couple of days, and have you been challenged or stretched? My orientation to these critical links are very connected with words with eco in them. So there's some words up the top here, and I want you to recognise, some people have never even thought about it, that economy and ecology have the same root. And that same root is that words beginning with eco are all connected to the Greek word for house, oikos, and the Latin word for household. So from my point of view, thinking about ecosystems is not some abstract notion of the environment external to myself. It is my home. We're talking about our home when we think about socio-ecological systems. And we're talking about our collective home. So our home as humans and with other non-human species. And so for me, this is the strongest connection, is this shared biosphere that James and other speakers have been referring to. And it's extraordinary to me, in fact, how disconnected we can be from this notion, that so often the environment is a source of hazards, animals are a source of hazards, of something nasty that's going to make me sick, and therefore I should be protected from them. And so I really, if there's nothing else you take from this entire talk, it's this notion of shifting our concept of the environment from a notion of hazard to a notion of home. And so one of the reasons why I consistently use the words ecology and ecosystems is for that reason. I find environment very helpful at times, but that's one of the reasons why I choose to use that word. So, we now get to spell critical together. Ha-ha! So the first 3 letters in critical spell C-R-I. This is not going to be a Sesame Street exercise, but we are going to walk down and explore different ideas here. And I could have put my C and my I in other places, as you can see, but I chose to cluster these 3 words together. And I find that one of the things that we tend to ignore, a critical issue, a critical dynamic that needs attention and ongoing attention that we need to acknowledge as something that's deeply challenging epistemologically and methodologically and operationally, is this difference between the collective and the individual. And just think of those of you that are engaged in research or practice, just how confusing that is. That things can make sense in an individual body, or a human body, a mouse body, a bird body. They can even make the sense in terms of plant. But when we start thinking about things in collectives, things get deeply disruptive in ways that are not necessarily conducive to how we tend to problem solve. And that we can try to understand those collective dynamics in terms of multiple linear relationships. But anybody that has dabbled in complexity thinking knows that we're dealing with complex feedback loops within the collective that are not fully understandable in terms of this is the emergent property dilemma. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. A truism, but it's deeply challenging. And so I'm not going to resolve this question for you, spoiler alert. I'm not going to resolve any of these questions, but I do think that it is worth our attention to try to be aware of when this tension occurs and to reflect on it and to not say, that's too hard, I'm not going to deal with it, because this is reality. We are individuals embedded within collectives. That is how nature works, and when we choose to ignore that, we are actually doing a disservice to ourselves as part of that whole. So, this is something that we will see in epidemiology and ecology and social dynamics and economic dynamics and health perspectives. It's a very common dilemma. Philosophically, it's also a point of real interest. So, I'm laying that out as one of the elements of critical links that we need to understand when we're thinking about human-animal interactions and interactions between species. So there is this interrelationship that I'm going to be exploring and this need for reflection. And so here is a very simple diagram, which is just a way of exploring this. And it's interesting how this diagram has helped a number of conversations I've had with communities often. So this is a diagram of a whole lot of separated things. This tends to be how we structure our institutions, tends to be how we do research, tends to be how we organise most things as humans, actually. It seems to be that we want to put things into categories that are understandable and that are manageable. And it's perfectly reasonable. It's not that this is a bad thing, it's just that it's an insufficient way of understanding the world. And the truth is that nobody's core mandate in this model is to take care of the spaces in between. Who's responsible for the bits in between? Who is attending to the whole? Who is recognising that these things are in relation to each other? Now, most people are stepping out of their comfort zone into a space in between and feeling rather lost and losing their voice because they need to get back to where they were and be comfortable again. And so, in fact, I think that part of our craft as we pursue this work is to enable people to feel comfortable, have built the tacit and practical skills to navigate those spaces in between. That's at its core a part of our interdisciplinary challenge. It's the difference between multi and interdisciplinary and possibly the trans, but I'm not going to go down that pathway right now. What I'd like to do is just to say that we need to learn about those spaces in between as a focus of inquiry and action, not as something that's annoying that we should just obscure and get back into our little box. And the truth is, one of the reasons for this is that our living systems are much messier than that. So here's a living system. This is this photograph taken over Saskatchewan. This is sometimes you can't see it very well. How annoying. You'll see that a couple of times. I can see it very well on my screen. Would you like to come up? What we have there, it's an image that will be played as a deeply grooved watershed in the landscape of Saskatchewan. a watershed that's carving out the landscape. And so we could talk about little pieces, but nature works with flows and interconnections. And we can't understand this particular watershed if we only focus on a wee box of it, because we're always going to be talking about the interconnections, the spaces in between. We can't understand a river in relation to just one arm of it. We need to be understanding it in relation to the landscape that it's draining, that 90% of any watershed, it's called watershed, but 90% of it's land. Water and land are deeply embedded with each other. It's like trying to understand fluid balance without looking what's in your intracellular space. That's how crazy it is to try to understand a river without actually looking at the landscape it's draining. So we have to be always asking the question of what's embedded with each other, and we also have to be asking ourselves the question of not just what's happening biophysically, but what's happening sociologically. So, and the social and ecological piece that comes to play. So this is just a watershed image of the Fraser Basin where I happen to be living. And it's not, in fact, the full boundary. It's sort of showing the rivers draining into the Fraser that remind us that actually any of these systems are really also socio-ecological systems, and that we can't really fully understand those social dynamics unless we're looking at the spaces in between. So I've raised a lot of questions about the spaces in between, and my next task, the T, is to take notice. Now, on one hand, this is just good practice. I imagine for a veterinarian, you are trained to observe, just as a clinician is. We should be looking at what is going on around us. Taking notice is something I think is trained out of us as we become more and more specialised. We stop taking notice of the things that are peripheral to our primary mandate. And so the task to take notice is telling us, as we heard many times from other speakers, this idea that there's imperative to bear witness to that we don't really want to know about. There is the imperative to not turn a blind eye. There is the fact that there is the service moment that makes us realise we have to do something, we need to act. There is the need to refuse to accept the unacceptable, as James Obinsky said today. And that the first step in doing that is taking notice. And so there is a certain element of this that is challenging, but there's also this extraordinary wonder that comes from taking notice. So in this context, taking notice is one of 5 ways to well-being that I'm going to show in the next slide. It challenges us to be curious, to catch sight of the beautiful, to remark on the unusual, to be aware of the world around you and what you are feeling, that reflecting on your experiences will help you appreciate what matters to you. So here, there is a word, this is a Guelph Development Symposium, and part of what we're doing here is we're developing ourselves, we're developing our capacity to deal with the tensions and incongruities that are constantly challenging us in our work. And so these are skills of observing, of taking notice, of things that are both challenging and inspiring that can be incredibly useful. And I would argue that when we stop taking notice, we're actually more likely to fall over than we are if we are actually properly paying attention. So taking notice in this context is actually one of the New Economics Foundation in the UK has focused on this foresight project on mental capital and well-being, and they've got some really fascinating work focusing on these 5 things that are instrumental, that are critical in enabling well-being. And they're very intuitive, but they're quite a lovely list. And I happen to be particularly fond of the taking notice one. So I'm going to expand this taking notice, and here, I don't think that you'll be able to see it properly, so as I was walking in tonight, feeling a little bit nervous, I happened to see this particular pattern, as I see it on my screen, is a watershed, but it happens to look like a leaf, or part of the circulatory system, or a fractal image. And it's not by chance that this is the way things look. And so as I walked in, I happened to notice it looked a bit like this tree that was just outside. And that was a nice moment for me. I felt better about coming in here, that I'd taken notice and seen that kind of connection, and that those are all around us, and they help us navigate through the challenges that we are observing. So I would ask you to take notice of some of the patterns that you have seen over the last couple of days. And those patterns include things like this recurring reference. I happen to be very interested in the concept of governance, so I have self-heard what I wanted to hear. But you will have also seen patterns that resonated for you, recurring ideas and themes and topics. So governance is something where I think that for this larger endeavour that's interested in research and action is profoundly important. And I think it's very helpful for researchers to think of themselves within this definition of governance, which is defined by Graham et al. In the Institute of Governance as the processes whereby societies and organisations make important decisions, determine who they involve in the process, and hold decision makers into account. So there are elements here about how we govern ourselves in society, but there's also elements here about how we govern ourselves in our institutions and our universities. There's also elements here about how we govern the governance processes we choose to use when we are designing our research. How are we making important decisions, determining who we involve and who is being held to account in our research? So it's actually quite a helpful set of language to remind us about some of the underpinning elements of research. And that can start to really land in very concrete ways when we're really recognising that here are some of the dynamics that I've heard in many presentations, people working with a variation of this kind of conglomeration of people. And that depending on where you are, depending on where you're working, different elements of this will really come to the fore. So this is something that I've been taking notice about how much in this conference there is attention to this. And I don't know that that would have been the case 10 years ago in quite the same way at a conference like this. I think our attention to this complexity has expanded, and that's really exciting, but it's also really challenging because each of these little dynamics involve relationships that can both be positive but also can really mess up. So we're dealing with the mess more and more as we step into this complex realm. And part of this challenge is this idea of research and integration within this broader concept. Another pattern, which is a really obvious one, but is this idea of these sets of words that are emerging. So again, if we imagined that there was a Guelph Development Symposium 10 years ago, I'm not sure, we might have, but we probably wouldn't have seen these two words at the top and the bottom quite so much. Both EcoHealth and One Health have emerged rapidly in the last decade. I happen to be more associated with the word EcoHealth, but I'm equally excited as the concepts around One Health, especially when they're broadly conceived to think about healthy humans, animals and ecosystems. And so this is a pattern that reflects change, but also in terms of if you're taking notice of this, you should also be taking notice of the fact that this is not a done deal. These things are very much in evolution. There's quite a tension for some people between these words. I don't think that's a big problem. I think it's entirely navigable, but we should be paying attention to these things and not consider them as annoyances that we have to discard. We should be finding in those tensions what's meaningful, what's helpful, what's driving better work. Personally, I'm very labelled with the EcoHealth word. I don't care, as I said earlier today, whether things are called EcoHealth or not. I'm most interested in whether they're actually attending to some of these critical linkages in a meaningful way. And as I'll emphasise in the next couple of slides, is that for me, EcoHealth was conceived as a space in which we are allowed to explore these tensions, and that it's a legitimate dimension of our inquiry rather than an inconvenience. So this list could be much longer, it could be much fuller, but it's just an example. What I've tried to do here is a sort of a little nested hierarchy of the different levels in which eco-health thinking is happening to emerge in the larger scheme of things. So I've been very involved with the establishment of the journal EcoHealth, with the International Association for Ecology and Health, with the COPE Canada, the Canadian Community of Practice and Ecosystem Approaches to Health, in a particular thematic area that both David Walter-Taves and Karen Morrison and other colleagues that have been at Guelph have really been involved with, in EcoHealth and Watersheds, and then there's sort of another nestedness down at the level of UNBC. I really want to emphasise, this is not me saying that this is the answer. This is simply observing a pattern that this kind of work is bubbling up in all sorts of different places. And I encourage you to find equivalent spaces that encourage you to deal with these tensions and to foster them at those different levels, because we need to be part of that collective process of creating spaces, not assuming it's going to be there for you, because if you assume it will be there for you, you'll probably be very disappointed. You need to be part of building our capacity to deal with this sort of thing. And so that's partly what this slide represents. And I will return to a fairly obvious sort of advertisement around the EcoHealth conference as we wind up here. So, I want to land on I for Indigenous. And some of you were at our session today for a couple of hours where I could start that session again here, which would be really nice if I could just embed it into our conversation. But this is, for me, a profoundly important element of the work, and that's partly because I'm from New Zealand and I've observed the incredibly important element of Indigenous perspectives influencing the work that I have done in Hawaii, in Ecuador, in northern BC, and ways in which we heard today that is enabling us to be thinking and shifting into new concepts. So a couple of images here, the Ahupua'a system, the mountains to sea system that I got to know in Hawaii, these extraordinary systems of management of our land-water interfaces that have traditional relevance, and we can see in all sorts of cultures all around the world these notions of stewardship and integrated stewardship, of caring for health, environment and community at the same time through the engagement with these kinds of processes, of the notions of a web of being. That's the bottom image here from the National Collaborating Centre for Aboriginal Health, where we're recognising that you pull one strand and others are affected, and the way in which, when we actually manifest that kind of thinking, it changes how we go about doing things. So the question for me, a little bit similar to what James Obunsky was saying today, the question is, who does what differently now? We've talked about all this stuff, so who's doing things differently? What's changed because of this effort? And certainly, I think we heard today in the session, and there's many examples of the way in which engaging with indigeneity and its fulsomeness is a lever for us relearning and rediscovering all sorts of pathways to change. I have particularly learned that in northern BC recently with this wonderful experience of helping to create a researcher to work with Sandra Harris of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation to create a digital story of exploring those relationships and learning about the deeply important language concepts. These are just examples. We heard a lot about stories today, and we have throughout the entire event of ways that these things intertwine and can teach us in ways that I think we need to be re-taught and we need to relearn. We may need to do some unlearning in order to relearn, but that's okay too. So of course I had to put the word context in, and I'll just move to this one reasonably quickly, in the sense of context for me is a really important word in terms of the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood. What I loved about looking for this definition is finding its Latin root in terms of con, together, which we all know, but in textere, in weaving. That is incredibly important, and that we need to figure out what prompts us to create an interwoven, integrated understanding of context. And as I've mentioned, watersheds for me are a really helpful way to do that, because they place us into a context, a socio-ecological context that exists. The problem with watersheds is they exist. This is how land-water health relationships are unfolding, pretty much always in a watershed. They demand us, if we're really paying attention to context, they will usually take us out of our comfort zones in some way, because context is very specific. And so there are acts of care and courage that are required in here. And I actually, to be honest, I was going to focus my whole talk on care and courage, but I'm just going to leave them as an idea here, because in fact the care idea, for those people that have moved from some form of clinical practice into these broader domains, it has to be a fundamental part of what we do, and it is deeply informative when we embed it into our work. So that Care and Courage, for me, one of the things it has led to is some really interesting partnerships. And I'm not necessarily attributing myself with Care and Courage. I have learned a lot about my colleagues having the care and courage to step out of their comfort zones, and in this case, working with a local health authority to think differently around the determinants of health and recognise the environment as a context for health. And this image here is one that was designed for the purposes of a position paper from this health authority in an effort for people to be able to see their context, to see that if we look in this kind of context, we can't understand it fully from a biophysical or a social or a health or any other lens. There is a way in which we need to, if we're to understanding any of those issues, we need to be informed by those contexts that we're in. And that can be quite positive in terms of these kind of nice cartoons, or it can be quite harsh, grim realities around incredibly rapid socio-ecological change that's happening in the landscapes that I'm living in northern BC right now, where we're not dealing with individual projects and individually fathomable acts that can be understood in isolation. Some of you will know Craig Stephen, a well-known vet who's been engaging in this complexity work for a long time, and Craig increasingly talks about interproblemarity, that we're talking not about interdisciplines, we're talking about problems that are intersecting and in ways that are deeply challenging us to be talking about critical linkages. So part of this skill, as we're getting to the end of the word, is, I've got no image for this one, and I purposefully did this. In some ways, I think taking notice, and this is probably one of the biggest messages, and that is that we need to observe how profoundly embedded dichotomous thinking is in the way that we do things, that we're talking about either or instead of both and that does change how we go about things, so that we can talk about hazards and home at the same time. We can talk about human and animal health and ecosystem health at the same time, and we should be looking at these things. We shouldn't be having to make choices about one thing or the other, and that it's a practice that once it was highlighted to me how often we use those words, and do I really mean or do I actually mean and when I'm talking about things, to be attentive to. A critical link that I'd encourage you to consider using. And we get to the L, the living systems, the lifescapes and the livelihoods. These are words that have been incredibly important to me in understanding health in the context of communities and environment. We heard today from Joy Pritchard around livelihoods, and many of you have worked in the livelihoods terrain. But for me, it's this combination that when we forget to be thinking about the environment as a living system, and we're just looking at it as a source of livelihood, we will miss a picture. If we forget that these are the environments where people's lifescapes are embedded, or animals' lifescapes are embedded, we'll be missing part of the picture. So again, this is a manifestation of and thinking, recognizing that at times with a particular research project, we may need to focus on just one dimension of this, but I would argue that a fuller and more a pathway to change will be more likely if you are actually acknowledging the interconnections among these things. And that there are ways in which we can create environments for people to learn about this sort of thing. So as I wrap up, I'm just going to be really flagging this idea of how are we convening, how are we building and developing this capacity to deal with some of these tensions. I'm very comfortable, actually, that I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing a few people frowning. And because I actually think these things they're pretty challenging to actually figure out how to put into action. But we are creative, as we've been hearing, we're creative, highly integrative beings if we allow ourselves to be. And so I would really encourage you, as you are leaving the conference, to be thinking about what spaces are you choosing to participate in that are challenging you to be thinking in new ways about these challenges? Or are you avoiding them for pragmatic or other reasons? That's fine sometimes, but be attentive to just how much you ignore them, and be attentive to potentially finding opportunities that work for you to pursue them. So as my final slides are, I will land on links, and this is to see if you're Is anyone watching? The whole talk was about golf. Really? No, of course it wasn't. I just enjoyed that was the first definition I got from the the links that I'm interested in are the ones that are a relationship between things, but I'm particularly interested in the verb version of links, and that there is what we're doing that we make, form or suggest. How are we forming these links? What's the action involved? And again, I think this conference is an example of those kinds of actions, and that I'm really interested in seeing. I particularly like this package of words. That events like this that are learning focused, that are integrative, that are encouraging non-dichotomous thinking, that are focused on knowledge and knowledges, and that are systems of knowledge, are where we may well do well to invest our time. So I would really commend that thinking, and the fact that can happen. These opportunities, we should be fostering these kinds of opportunities, whether it's in New Zealand, whether it's in BC, or whether it's in with women and children in India, and this image from IDRC. There are ways that we can create these kinds of spaces. I promised you an advertisement, so here is a final advertisement. And again, I wouldn't say that this is not the place. It is a place where these conversations, these tensions, these kinds of dynamics are being actively pursued, and it's in Montreal this year, which is really exciting. And it is going to continue to be a place where the EcoHealth, One Health conversations manifest, where people are taking the sorts of energy that's at this conference and pursuing them with colleagues from all around the world, and where I think an increasingly encouraging package of both researchers and actors and different kinds of institutions and different kinds of settings are being brought to the table in new and exciting ways. So this is one that's always nice as we're wrapping our head around this synthesis from an event like this to be thinking about what are the next ways, what's my next opportunity to be pursuing some of these challenges. And so I have taken you on a rapid spin around many things, and I hope that as you look at this cartoon again, that you will have possibly thought about some of those points of transition in some new ways, found them resonating with you, or found yourself suitably challenged that you'll ponder them for a while. And I really want to thank many people that have contributed to me being here. I want to again express my thanks for the invitation. I do want to flag in particular that colleagues at Guelph, such as Bruce Hunter, Karen Hall, Karen Morrison, David Waltner-Taves, people that I've spent time with here, have been such inspirations to me in my thinking around this, as well as a number of other people in projects that I've referred to tonight. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your attention to critical links, and I've been pleased to spend this time with you and share these ideas.